my name is Perrin Gerber, and I'm here to present to you the different forms of creatine analogs used in sports nutrition. My goal in giving you this presentation today is to help you understand the science and economics behind the types of creatine that I personally recommend for your new product. The first form of creatine, and the most basic, is creatine anhydrous. It's the backbone of every form of creatine that we'll be discussing today. What makes it unique is that the left side of this molecule has a number of nitrogen atoms there, and those allow it to bond with acidic type molecules such as citric acid or malic acid. And here's the table of the different creatines that we'll be discussing today. Creatine anhydrous is, as we discussed, just plain creatine without anything attached to it. Creatine monohydrate has water attached to it. Creatine citrate is creatine and citric acid. Creatine pyruvate is creatine and pyruvic acid. Creatine orotate is creatine and orotic acid. Creatine hydroxymethylbutyrate is creatine and hydroxymethylbutyric acid. And then creatine hydrochloride is just a salt form of creatine, and creatine gluconate is creatine bonded with glucose. Here I have a chart comparing all of those forms of creatine to each other in terms of price per kilogram. As you can see, creatine monohydrate is by far the cheapest form of creatine on the market, which is why we see so many products with creatine monohydrate in them. As you can see on the other end, we have creatine pyruvate, and that's why very few products have creatine pyruvate in them. So the advantages of creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate is cheap, and it's effective to help your athlete increase strength. Its only disadvantage is that it cannot be used in effervescent products. Effervescent products, as we've had you try in the past, are those that bubble up when they're poured into water. The water is what causes them to react, and because creatine monohydrate has water with it inherently, it can't be used, otherwise you end up with exploding products. The next form is creatine citrate. As we discussed before, it's just creatine and citric acid. The advantages of that is that it's also fairly cheap. It's effective for both increased strength and power output, and there's no need for additional citric acid because the citric acid is already present. The disadvantage really is that you need a higher dose of creatine citrate to give you the same amount of creatine that provides that strength benefit. Creatine pyruvate was the most expensive, as you can see by the disadvantages, and it also requires that higher dose. The biggest advantage to creatine pyruvate is it's one of the few forms of creatine that is extremely effective. In a study that compared creatine citrate to creatine pyruvate outperformed creatine citrate. They both had similar effects. The one benefit of creatine pyruvate over creatine citrate was that it increased energy expenditure. So by increasing your energy expenditure, you would essentially be able to burn more calories during a workout. Creatine orotate is a very new form of creatine to the market. It's not very popular at all. And the reason for this is that the science is not very consistent with its use. The orotic acid portion has been shown to kind of help with ATP production, but they've never studied creatine and orotic acid in combination with one another. So there's no knowing what the effects of creatine orotate would be. So as you can see by the disadvantages, it's expensive, there's very little research on it, it's difficult to source, and again, the higher dose that you have to use to get the benefit from the creatine. The next one is creatine hydrochloride. The biggest advantage to using creatine hydrochloride is that it's extremely soluble. A lot of times in the products that we make, you can see a chalkiness to the water, and you can feel the chalkiness in your mouth. And that's because the creatine hasn't dissolved all the way. You don't get that with creatine hydrochloride. It's also fairly cheap, and it might help with gastric stress. The claims on that have not been proven. It's more just anecdotal at this point. But as with creatine orotate, there's also very little research done on this form of creatine. So there's no telling if it really does help with your gastric stress, if it's better absorbed, if the dose that you need is lower, or any of that. There's no research to show that. Creatine gluconate, again, is just creatine and glucose. The thought process behind binding these two together was that by using creatine and glucose, you could increase insulin and thereby increase the absorption of creatine. The study that showed this, though, used 100 grams of glucose to demonstrate the increased creatine absorption. So, again, advantages, fairly cheap. It also might help with gastric stress because of the improved absorption. However, creatine gluconate in and of itself does not have that much glucose in it. So the benefits of using creatine gluconate can't be really demonstrated without using specifically creatine gluconate. As I said, the disadvantage is that there's very little research to support its use. Creatine hydroxymethylbutyrate. It's a mouthful, yes, I know, but it also is one of the best forms of creatine that's out there on the market. The advantage is that multiple studies have shown that it supports increased body fat reduction, increased muscle size, increased strength, and increased lean body mass. The only disadvantage, again, is the higher dose. Of course, it's also a little bit more expensive than creatine monohydrate. It's just not listed here. As far as the recommendations of all these forms of creatine, I've provided this chart, and you will all get a handout of this chart of which forms of creatine that I recommend right now. My recommendations would be to consider creatine HMB, creatine citrate, and creatine monohydrate. I recommend creatine HMB because of the science that's behind it, even though it's a little bit more expensive. I recommend creatine citrate because it's helpful for the effervescent products and it has a good flavor with it. And the science is also fairly strong to use it. It's not as good as pyruvic acid, as creatine pyruvate, but it's kind of like its little brother, so to speak. And then creatine monohydrate, of course, because that's the gold standard. You can't go wrong with creatine monohydrate. Creatine pyruvate, like I said, is extremely expensive. I would not recommend that creatine until the price of creatine pyruvate drops. I also wouldn't recommend creatine orotate because it's also cost prohibitive. I also don't recommend creatine orotate because the science hasn't shown that it's very effective. And none of the claims are supported by that. I also don't think that the creatine anhydrous, creatine gluconate, or creatine HCl are well supported by any research. If there are any questions, please let me know, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Yeah, that concludes my speech for the day. I hope that this will help you determine what you want in your product and to be able to inform me so that I can formulate it according to your expectations and meet those expectations. And that way we can save time in the future.